The neighborhood had always looked perfect from the outside: manicured lawns, white picket fences, and smiling faces. But behind those smiles hid the ever-watchful eyes of the HOA. They were the self-proclaimed guardians of community standards, always ready to issue warnings for the smallest deviation. The narrator, a quiet homeowner who took pride in his property, had always stayed under their radar, until one spring morning when everything changed. It started with a letter. The envelope, marked with the HOA's logo, sat smugly in the mailbox. Inside was a notice stating that his backyard fence was non-compliant. Apparently, its color, a natural cedar finish, clashed with the aesthetic tone of the neighborhood. The letter demanded he repaint it white within 10 days or face a fine. It was absurd. The fence had stood there for years, sturdy and elegant, admired by neighbors who passed by. But the HOA had recently elected a new president, a woman named Marcia, who took enforcement to a new level. At first, the narrator brushed it off, thinking it was a mistake. But within a week, another letter arrived. Then another. Each more threatening than the last. When he refused to change the fence, they began piling up fines: $50, then $100, then $250. The HOA's obsession with control became clear. They weren't trying to maintain order, they wanted submission. Soon, petty notices started arriving about his lawn being slightly uneven, about a visible trash bin behind his garage, and even about the shade of his porch lights being too warm. It was harassment disguised as regulation. Other homeowners whispered about it but did nothing. The HOA's power was too deep-rooted, their word, practically law. The narrator, however, wasn't one to bend easily. He knew that once he gave in, they'd find something else to nitpick. The fence had become a symbol, not just of his property, but of his right to live peacefully without constant intrusion. Then came the incident that set everything in motion. One morning, he woke to find HOA contractors standing in his backyard, uninvited, with buckets of white paint. They claimed they were correcting a violation. Without permission, they began painting over the cedar boards, splattering his grass and garden. It was trespassing, pure and simple. He confronted them, but the workers simply shrugged, saying they had orders from the HOA board. By the time they left, half the fence was ruined, blotches of uneven white over natural wood, streaked and ugly. His garden smelled of paint, his weekend peace shattered. And later that day, Marcia herself sent an email thanking him for finally complying. That was the breaking point. Something inside him snapped. He realized that no apology or argument would change anything. The HOA had crossed a line, literally stepped onto his property and defaced what was his. That night, he sat outside under the half-painted fence, thinking. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, and the scent of paint still lingered. But amid the frustration, an idea began to form. If the HOA wanted control, maybe it was time to show them what control really looked like. He started sketching on a notepad, measurements, heights, materials. His new fence wouldn't just replace the old one. It would dwarf it. He spent the next week researching regulations, actual county laws, not HOA bylaws. And what he found shocked him. The HOA had no authority over back fences beyond a certain line, their jurisdiction stopped before the property's rear boundary. They'd been bluffing all along. Every fine, every threat, all built on assumption, the plan evolved from a petty act of defiance to something more poetic. He would build a fence taller, stronger, and grander, one that not only restored his privacy but made a statement. The HOA might call it a violation, but he'd make sure it was perfectly legal. He visited the hardware store, buying heavy-duty posts, reinforced panels, and treated lumber. The cashier joked that it looked like he was building a fortress. He simply smiled. In a way, he was. Each day, as the sun rose, he worked. Digging post holes, leveling boards, measuring twice, cutting once. Neighbors watched curiously, whispering as the new fence began to rise, higher than any other in the community. The HOA patrol car drove by slowly every few hours, clearly agitated. But there was nothing they could do yet. By the end of the week, the first section stood proudly, tall, symmetrical, and unmistakably deliberate. The cedar wood gleamed under the sunlight, protected with a natural finish that contrasted beautifully against the sterile white fences around. It wasn't just a structure, it was a message. But as expected, the HOA didn't take it quietly. Within days, they mailed a formal complaint. This time, the letter accused him of altering the visual harmony of the community and demanded immediate removal. He didn't reply. Instead, he continued building, one section after another, until his backyard was entirely enclosed by the towering wall. The fence became a symbol of quiet rebellion. Neighbors began stopping by, admiring the craftsmanship, whispering things like, "Good for you," when no one else was listening. Some even confessed their own frustrations, the absurd fines, the constant surveillance. His stand had struck a chord. By the time the fence was complete, it stood nearly 8 feet high, within county limits but well beyond the HOA's comfort zone. It was strong, elegant, and private. From his side, the world felt peaceful again. But from the HOA's perspective, it was an act of war. That weekend, Marcia and 2 board members showed up, pacing outside his gate, taking photos and muttering. They looked powerless for the first time, trapped behind the very barrier they'd inspired. The narrator didn't open the gate. He didn't need to. The fence spoke for him. But as he sipped his coffee that morning, a new envelope appeared in his mailbox, stamped "Legal Notice." It seemed the HOA wasn't backing down. The battle was only beginning. The new fence had turned into more than just wood and nails, it had become a dividing line between freedom and control. For the narrator, it represented peace and privacy. For the HOA, it was a challenge to their authority. What began as a simple property improvement was now a full-blown neighborhood scandal. Within a week of the legal notice, the HOA escalated its campaign. They sent another letter claiming that the fence violated community aesthetic integrity and demanded immediate removal under threat of legal action. But when the narrator reviewed their bylaws and cross-checked them with actual municipal codes, it became clear that the HOA's claim held no legal weight. Their authority didn't extend beyond certain zones, and his fence fell entirely within his property rights. Still, that didn't stop them. The HOA started issuing daily fines, even though they were unenforceable without a court order. They sent contractors to inspect his yard, attempts at intimidation disguised as official visits. One morning, he even caught an HOA member peering through a small gap near his gate, clipboard in hand, jotting notes like a private investigator. The tension spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents secretly admired his courage, while others, the ones loyal to the HOA, treated him like a criminal. The board began holding emergency meetings, and his name became the headline topic. But behind the curtain of HOA meetings and legal posturing, something deeper began to stir in the community. People who had been silent for years began to question the rules that dictated everything from mailbox colors to driveway cracks. The fence had become a symbol of resistance, the moment one homeowner decided enough was enough. The narrator, meanwhile, stayed calm. Every letter from the HOA went unopened into a growing stack on his kitchen counter. He spent his evenings tending to his garden, enjoying the silence his tall fence now offered. It was the first time in years he could relax in his backyard without feeling watched. But the HOA didn't rest. A few days later, they filed a formal complaint with the local zoning board. Their argument was that the fence disrupted neighborhood uniformity. It was a weak case, but they hoped bureaucracy would slow him down. He received a notice of a scheduled hearing, one that could potentially force him to alter or remove the structure. He prepared meticulously. He gathered documentation, property lines, survey results, and photographs showing that other fences in the neighborhood exceeded similar heights in places. He even found clauses in the HOA's own bylaws contradicting their claims. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that their actions weren't about rules, they were about ego. The hearing day arrived on a gray, overcast morning. The small municipal room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. On one side sat the HOA board, led by Marcia, the woman who had turned community management into her personal crusade. On the other side sat the narrator, calm, collected, and armed with facts. The proceedings were straightforward. The HOA presented its complaints, emphasizing aesthetic damage and visual disharmony. Their words were lofty but empty. When it was his turn, he presented the evidence, clear, factual, undeniable. His property lines were precise, his materials compliant, his structure within all legal limits. When he mentioned the HOA's unauthorized trespass and property damage from the earlier paint incident, the room fell silent. By the end of the hearing, the zoning board dismissed the HOA's complaint entirely. The fence, they ruled, was 100% legal. The HOA had overstepped its authority. The victory was quiet but satisfying. As he walked out, Marcia's expression said everything: disbelief, frustration, and barely concealed rage. The HOA's iron grip had slipped, if only for a moment. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. The HOA wasn't the kind to admit defeat. True to form, their retaliation began subtly. One morning, his trash wasn't collected. The next, his mailbox was left open and damp from sprinklers. Then came a notice accusing him of unauthorized landscaping changes, referring to the potted plants he'd added inside his own backyard. It was clear they were trying to provoke him into reacting. But he refused to play their game. Instead, he leaned into patience and precision. If they wanted a war of persistence, he'd win it with logic, not anger. Weeks turned into months, and the HOA's tactics grew desperate. They began fining multiple residents over trivial issues, hoping to turn the community against him by claiming his defiance was causing stricter enforcement. But something unexpected happened instead. The neighbors began to rally. It started with whispers at mailboxes, quiet nods across driveways. A retired couple down the street decided to repaint their shutters a color not approved by the HOA. Another homeowner refused to pay a fine for leaving a bike in the driveway overnight. Slowly, the HOA's control began to crack. The narrator's fence had started a quiet rebellion, one built not from anger, but from principle. For the first time, people saw that the HOA's power depended on fear, not fairness. And when fear faded, control followed. Then, one morning, something unusual happened. The narrator stepped outside to find his entire fence wrapped in bright orange "Notice of Violation" tape. It flapped in the wind like a flag of defiance. Marcia had struck. Again, desperate for attention. But instead of tearing it down, he took photos, lots of them, and sent them directly to the county office with a simple report: harassment and unauthorized property defacement. The response came swiftly. Within days, a county official visited the neighborhood, inspecting not just his property but several others. What they found was worse than the HOA expected: mismanagement of funds, misuse of fines, and selective enforcement of rules. The HOA was placed under audit. Marcia's confidence cracked, and the once untouchable board began scrambling for excuses. As the investigation deepened, rumors spread. Residents whispered about secret budgets, misfiled paperwork, and favoritism among the board members. The illusion of authority began to crumble in real time. By the end of that month, the HOA that had once ruled with fear found itself surrounded by suspicion and anger, not from outsiders, but from the very homeowners it was supposed to protect. And through it all, the narrator remained calm, tending his garden behind his tall, beautiful fence, the same fence that had started it all. But he wasn't done yet. Because as the HOA unraveled, he saw an opportunity, not just to defend his home, but to change the system entirely. The time had come to take the fight to the next level. The morning sun rose over a quiet, uneasy neighborhood. The HOA's once feared patrol car sat idle, its tires gathering dust. The familiar threat letters had stopped arriving. What had once been an organized committee of enforcers was now a disjointed group of nervous board members. The audit had shaken them to their core. But for the narrator, this was not about vengeance anymore, it was about principle, about setting things right for everyone who had been bullied into silence. The investigation into the HOA's conduct uncovered more than anyone expected. Financial inconsistencies, unauthorized expenditures, and personal reimbursements for board lunches that never happened. The HOA had been using residents' dues as their personal bank account. The county demanded an emergency election to restructure the board, and until that was complete, all fines and enforcement actions were frozen. It was poetic justice. The same people who had invaded his backyard and mocked his defiance were now scrambling to keep their positions. Yet, through it all, the narrator never gloated. He had learned that true revenge didn't need to be loud, it just needed to be undeniable. But there was still one last thing he needed to do. The HOA system was too ingrained to collapse from a single scandal. To truly make change, he had to rebuild it, not destroy it. Over the following weeks, he began talking to his neighbors. Not through confrontation, but through calm, patient conversations. Many of them, once silent, now wanted to see change too. They had stories of their own, fines for minor decorations, warnings over holiday lights, even threats for leaving garbage cans out a few minutes too long. Together, they began forming an informal coalition, residents who wanted fairness, transparency, and freedom from harassment. When the special election was announced, his name appeared on the ballot, nominated by 3 different homeowners. He hadn't planned it, but when asked if he'd serve, he agreed. The HOA had ruled by fear long enough. It was time for someone to represent reason. The election day was tense. Residents gathered in the community center, the same place where Marcia once barked out orders during meetings. Now, she sat in the corner, avoiding eye contact. The vote was quick, and when the results were read aloud, the room fell silent. The narrator had won by a landslide. Marcia and her allies were officially removed. It was over, or rather, just beginning. As the new HOA president, he made his first act clear, a motion to rewrite the community's rules. No more arbitrary fines, no more harassment over harmless preferences. He proposed that homeowners should have the right to customize their property within reasonable safety standards, not based on personal taste or the illusion of uniformity. The proposal passed unanimously. For the first time in years, people applauded inside that meeting hall. Neighbors who had avoided HOA gatherings now volunteered to help. Transparency became policy, finances were posted publicly each quarter. The homeowners finally had control over their own community. And through it all, his fence still stood, tall, elegant, and strong. It had gone from symbol of defiance to symbol of independence. Children now played in backyards without fear of complaints. People painted, gardened, decorated, things that had once been deemed disruptive. The neighborhood didn't crumble, it flourished, months passed, and peace returned. But the story of the big fence became local legend. New residents often asked about it, hearing whispers of the homeowner who stood up to the HOA. It became more than just a fence, it was a story of how one person's quiet determination could change an entire community. Then, one afternoon, while trimming the hedges near the gate, the narrator saw Marcia walking by for the first time in months. She looked different, not angry, just tired. She paused for a moment, gazing up at the towering cedar panels. There was no confrontation, no bitterness. Only a silent acknowledgement. She had built her authority on control, he had built his victory on principle. The difference was clear in every plank of wood between them. As she walked away, he couldn't help but smile faintly. The battle had been exhausting, but it had meant something. He hadn't just defended his property, he had restored balance to an entire community. The fence, once controversial, now blended seamlessly into the landscape. Birds perched on its edges, vines slowly wrapped around the posts, and the afternoon light painted it gold. It stood not as a wall to keep others out, but as a reminder of what happens when one person refuses to bow to injustice. Years later, people would still talk about it. They'd tell new neighbors, that fence. That's where everything changed. And in a way, they'd be right. Because in the end, the fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was courage, patience, and the simple truth that when someone crosses the line, sometimes the best revenge is just building something stronger on your side.